Most of my classmates went on to four-year college. I was 3 units short. I did not. And I didn't have the money to go to four-year college either. So I stayed behind, and my friends went to Sac State and to San Jose State in the law enforcement programs there. And I became a school bus driver, so for a year. This was right around the time of the Gulf of Tonkin incident, which was a year or two before, and the resolution that gave President Johnson the ability to increase activities in Vietnam. After just 6 months of being a school bus driver, I quit, and I got out of the situation with unruly kids and early morning get up to take them to school. And I was a very anti-communist leaning guy, so I decided to join the Army. I went to basic training in Fort Polk, Louisiana, where some of you may have been, but it was a very typical basic combat training. It was in the spring, so it wasn't terrible in Louisiana. Luckily, it wasn't the summer. From there, I graduated and went to advanced training at Fort Holabird, Maryland, to the Army Intelligence School. When I joined the Army, I wanted to be a military policeman, but I went to testing, and they said, no, you should go into intelligence. And I said, okay, what's intelligence? So anyway, I went to the advanced training here. There we had a curriculum of learning about Russia and the KGB, British MI5. We took Russian language courses for 3 months. I took photography classes. We used this new Minolta, very miniature cameras. We learned current events and espionage. The Penkowski papers had been written a couple of years before, where a Russian general or colonel had defected and given the U.S. information that allowed Kennedy to ward off the Cuban Missile attack. So Penkowski was a topic of discussion there. The Russians arrested him after the Penkowski papers were made public, and he was executed the same year. In this training, we learned the common safes and file cabinets that were in businesses and offices. We learned how to break into those cabinets. We made our own lock picks. We learned how to burglarize buildings. Counterintelligence is gaining information about the foreign positive intelligence, spies spying on the military, and counterintelligence is trying to identify those folks. So, and intelligence is really just a support function for the field units in the field operations, knowing what the enemy was doing and what the enemy knew about us. So I graduated from the intelligence school, and I got orders for Chicago. I had been expecting to go to Vietnam, but I got Chicago. My classmate was from Chicago. He was married, and his wife was having a baby in a couple months. So we went to our commanding officer, and we traded orders. I gave him the orders for Chicago, and I took Vietnam. I was then assigned to Fort Bragg, North Carolina, and assigned to the 49th MI Group. This was a 24-person unit, 12 officers and 12 enlisted. For 4 weeks, we collected all the supplies necessary for a new intelligence unit to go to Vietnam. We shipped all that equipment, and then we boarded the plane, and we flew to Tacoma, Washington. But we didn't go by plane from there. We went to the docks in Tacoma, and we boarded a troop ship. the band played on and played us off. I boarded the Derby, which was a World War II troop ship that was formerly known as the Sims. The officers were in cabins, and the troops, me, was in the hold of the ship. There were 1,200 of us. We slept in hammocks that were 3 high off the deck, rifles slung under each hammock, and our duffel bags were off the end of the hammock. Typical military mess hall bathrooms in the back of the ship. It was 21 to 28 days at sea, and I was sick most of those days. We had KP. My assignment was to work in one of the stairwells, G5 or something, cleaning the stairwell. After you did your KP, you were free to go around the ship. But I was sick, so I went to the chapel, which happened to be right in the middle of the ship, and that got the least row on the boat. And I laid on the floor most of the time so that I get less movement. It seems that the only thing I remember eating during those 28 days was canned fruit. It was the only thing that seemed that I could tolerate. It was something like 7,000 or 8,000 miles from Tacoma to Vietnam. So on the way there, we stopped in Guam for a couple of days. We got off the boat for 12 hours, I think. We just stayed near the PX and the fast food places because on board ship, it was, like I said, I was eating canned fruit. So it seems like I remember finally getting some real milk in a carton. So when we got to Cam Bay in Vietnam, I didn't think it was Vietnam because it was a paradise. It was palm trees and blue, crystal blue water. There was no docks in Cam Bay, so our ship, we had to come up on top, and then we went over the side of the ship down a rope ladder with our rifles and our duffel bag. We lowered the duffel bags to the bottom. We got into an LCVP, and they took us to the beach, and we landed in Vietnam. On the beach, just immediately off the beach, there was a metal tarmac, a metal interlinked tarmac built on the sand so that it created a runway right there at the beach. We went to C-130 and we just stayed under the wing for about 18 hours. We got sandwiches and Cokes, and we waited for transport to Saigon. So it was like 9 o'clock at night. We boarded this thing and we took off from Cam Bay to Saigon. This is an overlay of Vietnam, just to give an idea for those of you who don't know Vietnam, how big it is. The DMZ is right about here. This is South Vietnam, and this is North Vietnam. Cambodia is right in this area, and Laos is up in that sector. And of course, this is open ocean. The Gulf of Tonkin incident occurred about in here. Vietnam is here, adjacent to China, Cambodia, Laos, and Thailand being here. We flew from Cam Bay to Saigon. It's now called Ho Chi Minh City. There we went to a compound, intelligence headquarters in Saigon. It was a big villa. We had quarters there. We were there for a couple weeks. We had daily briefings. We got new identification. We were there, as you see, in civilian clothes. We got new identification. Mine was as a civilian contractor with the Department of Defense, as a sociological survey person. I was doing a sociological survey of the Vietnam War on the economy. the briefing I got about my undercover story would be that I was trying to evaluate the cost of the war and the inflation on the economy. One of those things was that ultimately I put together at the near the end of my assignment in Vietnam was that when I arrived in Vietnam, a pedicab, which is a bicycle like this, where they would send you around. Sometimes there were a motorcycle with a couple, so two people could ride in it. But for 25 cents, this guy would take you anywhere in Saigon. When we first arrived there, in the first 2 weeks I was there, we explored Saigon to the shops. It's a big city. The Continental Hotel, there's really nice hotels and flower shops. Everything that's in a regular city is Saigon. So we formed up here, learned what our assignments may be. We were waiting for what our orders were. So the new credentials I got identified me as a civilian contractor. So.
Was that you in there in the picture? Were you in the picture?
No, these are two of my buddies that came with me on the ship. So we had 2 weeks really just to do nothing, to get processed with the new ID, be issued weapons. The weapon I was issued was a snub-nose 38 and a whole shoulder holster. So, and for the first 4 or 5 weeks I was there, I flew around different places in Vietnam with just that weapon on me, and no other support weapon. Until I flew one from Saigon, or from Can Tho to my ultimate duty station, and as we were flying, I could see tracers coming up from the ground towards the aircraft, and we all talked about it. And if we were crashed and I hit the ground with a snub-nosed revolver with 6 bullets in it, I would have been in a world of hurt. So I changed weapons at that point. But to go on, this is the pay that we got in Vietnam. We got overseas pay of $8, and $65 is imminent danger pay or combat pay. I saved $300 a month and only took $100, which I bought MPC, military payment certificates, which was the military payment, and then the Vietnamese dong, D-O-N-G, was what you used on the economy. I was assigned then, let's see whether, one of the odd things is I went to the Saigon Zoo. So thinking that there's a zoo in the middle of a combat zone was, like I said, this was a regular city. It wasn't there was no firefighting going on when we arrived there. So ultimately, this is a map that shows a number of things. This is the Ho Chi Minh Trail in Cambodia and Laos. And this is where most of the Agent Orange ultimately was being used. It was used in different places around Vietnam, but here it would have just flown the whole length of the trail. Saigon is here. I ended up getting orders for Saigon to Can Tho. From Can Tho, this was my headquarters, but I was then assigned to a small town called Rak Ya, which is right here. And it's in the province of Can Giang province. I was assigned to an outpost in an old city. It was about 1,000 years old or more. The French had been there before us. And we weren't the only boots in the ground. The French weren't the only boots in the ground. In 1943, the Japanese were in possession of Vietnam. In 1852, Napoleon III sent 2,500 troops to Vietnam to try and develop a new market, since they were the dominant military force in the world at that time. So over the years, a lot of boots had hit the ground. There's a monument here in Colorado called Soldier Stone, and that monument memorializes the fact that there was so many troops in Vietnam. It recognizes the impact of the military on the economy, on the citizens of Vietnam, and the footprint that the U.S. made in Cambodia, Laos, and Vietnam. It's a very interesting monument. If you're a Vietnam vet, I recommend making that trek and going up to Soldier Stone. You can look it up on the internet. Today, the chapter of the Vietnam veterans that I belong to is making a trek there with about 10 vets to go and visit Soldier Stone. So in that monument, there are 36 separate monuments in a range in a field that are in different languages, from India to Lao and Cambodian. Bible verses. It's a moving monument that kind of changed my idea about Vietnam. I left a ribbon of my Purple Heart on the stone, and others before me have left other mementos that were personal to them. They wrote notes into notebooks that were left in ammunition boxes, so if you go there, you can plan to do that yourself. So the town of Rakya, go ahead, honey, is a small village. This is a picture from the apartment building I was living in. This is downtown Rakya with shops and shops along here, and then just open air cellars of fish and food. I lived on the economy, so I bought all my food, mostly seafood and vegetables, off of the market here. There's a bridge right across the channel. This is a public square. This is the only TV in town. Every night they had TV in Vietnamese here, so it was blaring loudly for up until about 10 or 10:30. So people would just come and stand around and sit around in here. I was assigned as liaison with the Vietnamese National Police and the Vietnamese CIA, which was called the An Nguyen Doi. The two officers that I worked with were captains were the chief of police and the chief of the Vietnamese CIA. Each of them had a cadre of either police officers or intelligence agents. My assignment was to get to know them, to get to work with them. I went on regular police duty, responding to domestic situations, going to opium dens and making arrests, and then responding also to Viet Cong activity, and then reporting that information back to my headquarters in Canton or onto S2 in Saigon. Got to catch up with myself here so I can keep track. Okay. Just outside of Saigon, Rakya, the jungle started, and the average elevation in 4 Corps, which is where I was, 4 Corps is the bottom half of Vietnam, with I Corps and 2 Corps and 3 Corps here, and then 4 Corps is down in this area. The average elevation in 4 Corps was 4 feet. So there was no mountains here except up along the Cambodian borders where it was more mountainous. Mostly rice fields. This was kind of the breadbasket of Vietnam. The Mekong River runs up through here. And Canton is another major city in the 4 Corps. The 9th Infantry came into Vietnam while I was there in 1966. I was one of the early people in Vietnam. We had about 400,000 troops there at that time. It built up over time more. The thing that was different about Vietnam than some of the conflicts we've been in recently is we had a 1-year DEROS. We had a 1 year where we had to be in country. When that 1 year was up, the 365th day, if you were in combat, a helicopter came in and pulled you out and you were gone and put on a plane and sent back home. So that was something we all kind of lived for, is that 1 year anniversary to get out of Vietnam. I had a little different experience because of the assignment I had. I had a little more flexibility because the duty station I was assigned to was an apartment building where we had an office there. Three agents were assigned to this one outpost, but I never saw the other two except for the days that for 1 week when I first arrived. The guy I was replacing briefed me and showed me around town. And then he left, and the other two guys were on TDY. They were gone from the station, and I never saw them the whole time of 10 months that I was in Vietnam. I taught English on Tuesday and Thursday nights, which was really just cleaning up English for most of the officers and NCOs that I was working with. I was only working with ARVN, with Vietnamese soldiers. There was no American troops where I was. The 9th Infantry was in other parts of Vietnam, down in this area and around Saigon. But up in this area, we didn't have any American troops. We only had American advisors. At the province level, they had the province chief had a lieutenant colonel. The U.S. Army lieutenant colonel was his advisor. Every other Vietnamese office had an American advisor assigned to that unit. So in the Vietnamese Army, we had senior NCOs assigned to the infantry, working with them and being advisors to them, going in the field with them, and calling in support. I went duck hunting and fishing. This is a fish trap out in the Gulf of Siam, which is just right here. It's now called the Gulf of Thailand. I don't know why they changed it, but this is about 7 or 8 feet of water. They put bamboo rods down into the water right next to each other, and then this is a little opening here where fish can swim into this area, but then they're trapped in this point. So fishing here was, once we got to this place, a hand grenade would be thrown into the middle of that, and the concussion would kill all the fish in that, and they would all float to the top. We'd take a net, scoop them up, load the boat with fish, and we'd end up with 200 or 300 fish, and that fish was taken back and shared with the police and the CIA agents and taken back to their compound where they all were living with their families. So that's fishing in Vietnam. This is a Vietnamese Navy boat. This is the level of Navy. It's a 30 caliber machine gun on the front. This is just a sampan about 40 feet long with a gasoline engine. Sometimes they only looked like the engine's about that big. But this is a wooden boat, and that's their military level that was in the town that I lived in. So they all had eyes on the front of the boat so they could see when it was foggy. My sources of information were Buddhist monks who were able to travel around the countryside. This is a Buddhist temple. Other CIA agents. In the apartment building I was living in, the US CIA also had agents there, and the Treasury Department had agents there, and there were a couple other advisors from the US government that were there. All of them were TDY. I was there for 1 year. These other guys were there for like 6 months at a time. Their assignments were classified, I guess, you would say, and I didn't know everything they did. They didn't talk about it a lot, but they were always gone at nighttime and not during the day. They slept during the day, so they were doing something different than I was doing. So we also then, of course, the villagers, and I had an interpreter that I went with whenever I went into the field that was an intelligence agent. Most of my officers and NCOs that I dealt with spoke pretty good English, and I learned over that period of 10 months to speak some Vietnamese, but I didn't have to because they were more fluent in English than I was in Vietnamese. Being a civilian in town, this is the National Police, and this is usually they rode around with 4 guys in a Jeep. So, and they did a regular police activity, like I said, with domestic response and just policing the town. These are the Arvin soldiers in the province headquarters area. We had 2 forward air controllers, 1 Air Force and 1 Army. The Air Force fact pilot was flying this plane. It had rockets on the wings. The rockets were smoke rockets. So when he would go out in support of troops and they encountered an enemy, he would go in and they try to mark where the enemy was located, and then he would call in the Phantom or the jets to come in and bomb the area. The Army forward air controller was working with the artillery in support of troops on the ground. So he would, and both of them kind of flew around looking for people to shoot at them, which was not a very fun job, I'm sure. I never did fly with them, but they were pretty cool guys to talk to. Major Burns became a good friend, and he became a closer friend later in my assignment there. And he was Air Force. This was my mode of transportation a lot, going back and forth from Rakyat to Saigon especially. I would hitch a ride with these guys. They had pretty regular trips every couple days. This was an amazing airplane. It was a short takeoff and landing aircraft. It could land in about 4 feet. It seemed like you would just come down and they would just be teetering, and then they'd just drop the wheels on the ground. Maybe it was more than 4 feet, but it was very short. Takeoff was he was in the air within about 100 feet. And then it seemed like you could go straight up. This is a turboprop airplane. Just the funnest thing to fly in. I'm a private pilot, and this got me started with the idea. So this was a regular transport when I needed to get to Saigon. Of course, Stars and Stripes was the military newspaper in Vietnam. Sergeant Mike was my favorite. I've collected several of his cartoons. As you can see, this means something to guys in Vietnam, but booby traps were something we were all worried about. Sergeant Mike kind of spoke as a regular troop. I won't try to tell you that they're funny or not. Some people do find them funny. Some say, well, I don't understand. Of course, Agent Orange was something we all knew about. Mostly along the Ho Chi Minh Trail was where the biggest areas were covered, but all over in different parts of Vietnam, wherever the jungle was creating a problem, they would fly in a C-130. They would fly in tandem or 3 or 4 at a time, and they would just fly across big areas, and it would kill all the vegetation. So if you went into the jungle, there's just leaves on the ground and poles sticking up in the air where trees used to be. Palm trees, the fronds would just fall on the ground. Just a devastating area. We didn't know and we weren't cautioned about Agent Orange at the time. I didn't go into the jungle that often where I had, only a couple times did I go where there was this stuff. It's kind of an oily, terrible, you didn't want to get it on your clothes. But this is Agent Orange just being flown in a helicopter. The helicopters had sprayers off the side on the back, and they would just load that onto this helicopter. Helicopters were used for smaller areas along roads and along river banks to kill the vegetation. And then there wasn't just Agent Orange, there was a rainbow of herbicides that were used. Actually, there were 13. These are 6 of the major ones that were used. Agent Orange being the one that was most used after they experimented with these other items. Then after 10 months in the assignment, I was planning a R&R in Penang, and I was going by myself, but I started collecting money from guys that I was there with, and to buy watches. For 3 of them wanted watches, so they gave me money. I was going to go, next week, and I got a chance to recover some weapons in a village some distance away from town. So I went with 14 military police and CIA agents. We left at 3 in the morning by sampan, a small ship, a small canoe kind of boat. And at 6 a.m. we met up with the ARVN, Army of Vietnam troop of about 60 to 90 soldiers. There was an American advisor, first sergeant. It was a ranger. I had never met him before, Sergeant Chelinsky. He was in charge of that group along with the commanding officer. We then met up together. We went then along the trail to approach the village that we were going through. The scouts ahead of us started finding booby traps and wires across the path that we were going on to get to the village. The scouts would pull away the vegetation and mark the wires and mark the device, and then we would have to step over that wire and march on. And with so many of us, it was nerve-wracking to do, to say the least. After the second one that we went across, as I got on the other side, my radio operator, I helped him across because he had a big backpack on his back. And after he got across the wire, he stepped back off of the trail and he fell into a foot trap and started screaming. As I went over to lift him up and try to take his back radio off of him, one of these devices detonated. So this is the telegram my parents got. And this was the Tricom grenade that I saw that were marked by the scouts. To me, these, I remember them being this big, but I think in reality they were regular grenade size. But over the years, I may have amplified those until I looked them up on the internet, and they were a lot smaller than I remembered. Anyway, this was the telegram I got, or my parents got. My father was kind of a hard-nosed guy, but when he saw the yellow cab drive up, we lived out in a rural area, and he was sure that it was noticed that I'd been killed. Luckily, I wasn't. This is me. I had both legs broken. Sergeant Cholinsky, who I had just met an hour and a half before, was standing by me when it was detonated. This is my radio operator. He was killed. 10 ARVN soldiers were killed. Cholinsky, I learned later, had his spleen. He was injured in the stomach mostly. I only got hit from the waist down. I still have 50 pieces of metal in me. We got into a small firefight then. I lost my weapon when this detonated. I wasn't able to help at all, and I was more concerned about these legs because my feet were laying off in different directions than what they normally would be. And I just laid flat on the ground when the shooting started. Later on, when I was in the hospital, I didn't know it at the time, but they took a bullet out of my back. So sometime during after the detonation, I was shot in the back. So we were rescued. I reached over Cholinsky to get to the radio, and I called in the radio for help. And Sergeant Burns, the FAC pilot, had been flying around near us, and he responded. He told me he thought he knew where we were, and he asked me to throw smoke. So I took a smoke grenade and I popped it, and it was purple smoke. I told him it was purple, so he knew where our location was. Then he called in the rescue crew, and the National Police and a bunch of American advisors showed up to rescue us. They had to come by boat. An LCVP came by canal, and then they cut their way in from the canal to us along the trail. They took us to a place where helicopters could land, and I was flown to one of these units. It's an air-conditioned emergency field hospital. I was here from that morning overnight, and overnight we were mortared, and this thing is blown up by air, and when the mortars hit, it deflated it, and it started to collapse in on us. I think there was only about 7 or 8 beds in this thing, but they came and put 2x4s or wood holding the top up from collapsing down on top of us. That next morning, I was flown from here to Vung Tau, to a hospital in Vung Tau, and there they put casts on my legs, and then they cut the cast open so that they could clean my wounds while I was in the hospital for 2 or 3 days. They don't do surgeries in Vietnam because of infection. They don't want to close you up in a cast. So twice a day, they would come and lift my legs out of this cast and clean them with brushes and just to keep them clean. Then they would put me back in the cast, put the top on, and tape it closed. So it was that way for several days. I was then flown to Johnson Air Force Base in Japan. I had surgeries there. This is a Steinman pin. The stainless steel pins were through the bone in my leg, and a pin through my ankle. And then the casting would be to hold my leg up because it was broken off. They held the upper leg about a quarter of an inch away from the bone, and eventually the bone grew down together and formed a collar over 6 months around my leg. But at the time, when I would go to a new hospital, like I was transferred in from here to a C-140 in Tokyo and flown to Letterman, each place I stopped, the medical personnel said, "Oh, Dr. McDonald did your leg." So this was a new way of putting your leg in traction and letting the wounds heal. So it was kind of fun to have people say, "Oh, you had Dr. McDonald work on you." So I had 2 surgeries. I did get infections on one leg. I was in the hospital for 6 months, and I returned to duty. I was promoted to sergeant. I was assigned in San Francisco, and I did background investigations for security clearances. And at the time, we had riots going on about the Vietnam War. So one of my jobs was, our office was right in downtown San Francisco, in an office building where we could see the Civic Center. And we took pictures of everyone that was part of it. Another assignment was doing penetration inspections of Army facilities. The Nike Hercules sites were around San Francisco at the time, and we would do security surveys and try to get into a base with some obvious bruises that were intended to be caught, but we never were caught. And we would go in and put 4x4s painted red that said TNT on them, and we go into the Nike Hercules site and set them down, and then go out and tell the commanding officer that we just blew up his facility. So it was a different assignment. This in '69. I got out of the Army. I met my wife, fell in love, and started a career in law enforcement. For the next 38 years, I was in law enforcement or corporate security. Now I'm living in Westminster. I'm involved with the board of directors for the Vietnam Veterans of America, Chapter 1071 in Lakewood, and I'm the speaker coordinator for the chapter. So that's my life. So thank you. Any questions?
Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Are you flying back?
We have
Or did
another-
you fly back, or did you have to take the ship back?
No, I flew back from Japan in a C-41. Supposed to take 13 hours. It only took 9 hours because of the airstrip. No, I didn't get seasick. But it was a hospital transport, so all of us were in the C-141. We're all medevac. Yeah.
You were in counterintelligence. Did you ever run into any espionage?
No, but one of the things,
Espionage.
one of the assignments was the 2 captains that I was assigned to. One of my direct orders was to monitor their sympathies about the war, and because they were both college-educated guys, they went to Paris and were actually in college together as Army officers. They were the chief of police and the chief of the CIA, but they were first Army officers. They were both captains, and I was supposed to monitor the NCOs and the officers in the province, and report anybody that showed any inclination of being sympathetic to the Viet Cong. None of them showed any of that. In fact, to the opposite. One of the things I did was interrogations of suspect Viet Cong. We only had Viet Cong. The NVA had not penetrated down into Fort Corps at the time I was there in '66. I think later on after Tet, they were down in Fort Corps. Some of my partners who were in the 9th Infantry may know whether the NVA, they encountered the NVA at all, but where I was, it was only Viet Cong, which were villagers who worked during the day, and at nighttime they became soldiers and attacked outposts. And that was a lot of response that we did do. It seems like every couple days an outpost would get mortared or shot at, and we would go out and try and interview how that all happened, how they were attacked, what they were attacked with, and that kind of thing. And we were looking for communist propagandists that would come to villages and try to recruit the Viet Cong. That was another target. One other target, when I was in Saigon, we got briefed on 10 Americans that were prisoners of war at that time. They were actually, there were 10 people that were prisoners of war in '66, and while I was there, 3 of them were French soldiers from the Dien Bien Phu time, and so we had these dossiers of each of these individuals, and I did mount one operation where I developed information of a prisoner of war camp, and it was actually from a Buddhist priest, and I reported that up to S2 in Saigon, and Special Forces mounted an operation to try and rescue. They found a camp, but it was weeks old, and I thought really we had something there because everyone that we interviewed was so positive that they were there right then. So it was pretty exciting at the time, but it turned out to have no value. Yes?
Can you tell us what the telegram said? And then I had a couple of other questions.
Oh, well, the telegram says, it's right here,
Oh, I see.
it's to my parents. It's from the Secretary of the Army, has asked me to inform you that your son, Corporal Raymond D. Nunes, was slightly wounded in Vietnam on 7 August 1967 as a result of hostile action. He sustained metal fragment wounds to the body and both his legs were broke. He was checking a village with the National Police when hit by fragments from a hostile booby trap. He was treated at the 9th Medical Battalion, APO San Francisco 96370, and is being held for further treatment. Address mailed to him at that above address facility. Since he was not, repeat, seriously wounded, no further reports will be furnished. So that's what my parents got.
Okay, and then I wanted to ask you, you went into that village to do what?
To recover guns, and it was a Viet Cong suspected village. We were pretty sure that the chief of that village was a leader of the Viet Cong. So the information we had was that there were guns hidden in a certain hooch in the ground, and we were going there to search that one village, and we wanted to take over the village completely. That's why we had so many troops, and recover those weapons and then kind of put them out of business, we hoped. We never got to the village.
Yeah. So I'm wondering that whoever reported this was, set you up with those booby traps to go in there and to sabotage. But you never know.
You never know. Yeah, I never asked. So yeah, you don't know, and
You just do what you're told.
This was my information, so I was pretty. I was relying on a pretty significant source that I trusted, and it was endorsed by the other 2 captains that I was working with. They also felt it was reliable information.
But if they thought it was reliable, they could they have bombed that village or not? I know that's,
No, I don't think that we would have done that kind of that's pretty radical to just take out a whole village. Even though you hear about those things happening, that's not the resources that we had or that we would use, in my experience. So. Anybody else? Yeah.
That MUST unit, was that 9th Battalion then?
They what?
The MUST unit you took you to?
It may be. I don't know where it was located. It was a helicopter ride that I hardly remember. I do know I was smoking at the time, and I stopped smoking from that point on and never smoked again. So I've only smoked in Vietnam because I got free cigarettes. It's pretty, but I really abhor smoke after that, it seems. I also because I used cigarettes as payment for some of these information that I got. I also had, instead of paying with money, I paid with cigarettes, and also I had a supply of scotch that was used in trading for information. So that, I didn't have money to trade. That was what I used to pay off people. Yeah.
Any ideas about, based on your experience and all of the insurgencies or small wars that have happened since, anything that you learned at all that one you've either seen us wake up to and use in future wars, wars that happened after Vietnam, or any thoughts you have about do's and don'ts from the perspective of national strategy, or even tactics that we should learn, lessons learned going forward?
Well, to go into the field and not be fully, I was not a combat troop. I was an intelligence agent. So I would say don't go into the field if you're not trained. But as far as the insurgencies that are happen around the world, my thing I've learned is wars don't accomplish anything. I was very gung-ho to be in Vietnam. I was gung-ho a bit afterwards, and I no longer have that feeling about Vietnam. It was a waste of resources. We had 58,000 men lost in Vietnam. It was something like 340,000 were wounded. 2 million citizens were killed during the Vietnam War, likely. And what was the result? Ho Chi Minh beat the the French, he beat the Japanese, and he beat the Americans. So war, in my view, doesn't have any place anywhere. We didn't need to be in Afghanistan either. That's a lesson that was another one that we got out of Afghanistan, not unlike Vietnam.
Yeah.
So those are things, any war is not worth fighting. A lot of them are religious wars, and that's not something that we should be involved in, I think. So that's the only thing that I've personally come out with.
What about World War II?
World War II is a very different war. That was a war of principle and ethics. So if we didn't fight World War II, we'd all be speaking German. So I think World War II is a very different situation. It was a world war. All these other wars, Vietnam especially, was just a skirmish, more or less. You call it the Vietnam War, but it was more or less an undeclared situation. So none of these wars have proved to be worth fighting, in my view. So, yeah.
One more question. That picture of you after you got hit, were you wearing a flak vest?
I was wearing, not in that picture, but I was when I was hit.
Okay.
I think I was shot through the vest because it was the bullet was stuck between my ribs, didn't go all the way through.
All right, yeah.
So I took that off while I was waiting. It was just too heavy. It wasn't a bulletproof vest. It's just a flak vest.
It's a flak vest.
Yeah, it's not. It wasn't bulletproof in any way. It probably slowed down a round. So.
Just curious, yeah.
Yeah, I just took it off when I was on the ground. It was hotter than heck.
Well, yeah.
Okay? Yeah.
One more. What you said, you just said words don't matter.
No, wars don't matter.
Wars.
Wars.
What
But World War II is different in my view.
do you what about the Cold War? How would you?
Well, the Cold War got